Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a beautiful sunny day in the garden. Or rather, it had been gray and rainy, and now it's beautiful and sunny in the late afternoon. Last night I was having a conversation with a close friend, and it became very rich and deep. And the magic of a conversation can be hard to preserve and carry forward in our memory. At least it can be for me sometimes. Because a conversation is a bit like a dream. If it's a really good one. And this was a really good one. There were so many astonishing things we explored together. I'm really grateful for that conversation. And we were talking about deep things, the nature of spirituality and birth and death, the narratives we've been exposed to and some of which we've chased in our own ways throughout our lives. And both me and my friend have backgrounds that involve what might be referred to as mystical Christianity. You know, we're born into the world of humans, and then over time we're exposed to these narratives, many of which over time have undergone weaponization. Right? And by weaponization I mean that something was added to the narrative that threatens us if we don't take it up. So there's a common threat, which is eternal damnation. Essentially, this can be understood in different ways. It can be understood as being tortured forever in a kind of hell, or a simpler and stranger threat is that we would be evicted from the presence of the divine permanently. Something that is otherwise always with us. And there's various different kinds of weaponization we might encounter in spiritual stories. And it's a complicated mess because certainly in birth and death we can get into some trouble. In all kinds of different ways. And it's not my intention to explain any or all of this or to go over it in depth. But even many different spiritual narratives have something resembling hell. And so, for example, in Buddhism, and you know, when I use this word Buddhism, I'm referring to 1,000 different things, not one. And the same is true of Christianity or Islam or Tantra. whatever narrative we might pick, there's 1,000 variations now. But in Buddhism, the common thread is simply rebirth, perhaps not in a human form. Right? We might be born in a form that we would imagine, or it's reasonable to think, or people with vision have told us, have a form that has vastly fewer degrees of liberty. And so in Buddhism, it's commonly something like the following is commonly said, that a human birth is the most amazing birth you can have. It's better than being born as a deity. And I'm familiar with a lot of these narratives. And I can see the evidence of them being weaponized over time, though it doesn't mean that there's no danger just because they've been weaponized. I think there's some danger in life, in pathfinding in life. But it's also clear that the stories have undergone waves of weaponization over time as a way to gain converts. Though it's a strange idea, for example, that whatever might be referred to by the word God, and I think there is something meaningful this word refers to, generally speaking, but the idea that whatever might be being referred to by this word, or we might mean by this word, the idea that we have to be threatened into loving it, and threatened with severe, perhaps permanent, forever punishment if we don't get it just right. This is a terrible idea. And I know something about the origins of the weaponization and its functions and this and that. And in our time, damn near everything is weaponized in various ways, especially in our socio-cultural linguistic experience. And this is schizogenic. It produces these kinds of weaponizations are deeply implicated in the minds of people who suffer from psychosis and schizophrenia. Because on the one hand, we can't be perfect, and we're not even sure how to get it right, or if it's even possible to get it right. Or we can imagine some very extreme, idealized, monastic existence in which we get it right. But we're incapable of embodying that. And so we're getting it wrong in a way that we're consciously aware of, getting it wrong. And thus we must certainly be in great danger of, if these narratives are truthful, we're in some kind of great danger of losing our soul and losing our original light, or losing things that were associated with us. There's a small creature here I've never seen before, and it can hop. And what is that? It's kind of like a sort of cricket, but it's really tiny. Oh, and there's a little itsy bitsy mite near it. I've never seen this creature before. It's rather fast. so there are all these problems. That we face in trying to understand something about what's really going on and what's really important. And all of this is deeply troubling because, in a very important sense, we are like children. And I strongly suspect that secretly in our human lives, and this came into our conversation last night, it might be as if our life is a kind of a womb in which an embryo is undergoing phases of development. But it's not a physical embryo, it's a transcendental embryo. And the development goes in waves, and we're blind to all of this, mostly, though we have intuitions and feelings around it. And this is one of the beautiful tropes that came out of the conversation last night, and it was suggested by my friend. And I think there's really something to this. There's something very delicate and beautiful and innocent that's undergoing a strange sort of bipolar transformation. It's growing in us. And though we think of death as the end of life, it is just as likely that it's the birth of this embryo into a new way of being. And I'm not sure well, the trope itself, when I say it's bipolar, it's because there's a kind of a worldly education we undergo, where we learn language and we develop physical skills and cognitive skills, relational skills, pragmatic skills. So there's that branch of being embodied that's certainly part of what's going on, but there's something deeper and profound. And really, I think of birth as a human sometimes a bit like preschool for something so astonishing we would never be able to imagine it. Though we're made of it. We are it. It's just that our conscious minds can't form a figure capable of containing it or really even pointing meaningfully at it. Though we get near this sometimes with song or dance or poetry or love. And so, since I think we're all, in a way, like little children inside in our interiority, and yes, there's all this narrative about grow up and be strong and be tough and all these things for men, and be pretty and be sexy and be intelligent, or whatever it is the imperatives for women become over time, and how the genders get divided from one another, and all kinds of these things happen. It just seems very fraught and cruel, because we're actually very vulnerable and delicate in an aspect of how we are in being. It's not the only thing. I mean, there's something astonishingly resilient about us. Huh. As if, in a way, we can't be harmed. Even though we can suffer and feel pain and loss and be injured and have illness, and be confused, feel sadness or grief or agony. At the same time, there's something inviolable within us. Something immortal already by its nature. Now, it's not strange that the human world would be unfriendly to our interiority, our soul. But it's weird that the religions would have to use threats, condemnations, judgment, and rather cruel criticality in an attempt apparently to force us to love something that it's absolutely natural for us to be and with and adore. What's all this noise? And part of the problem is that there's a kind of swarm of doll-like mannequins running around without their souls in the human world, wanting to judge and dominate and control and threaten and terrify and convert other soulless mannequins. And maybe even there's some imperative to evict our souls from our common awareness and experience. So there's some mysteries here that are worth exploring, and I often explore many of them. But today, I want to talk about remembering. And this isn't the first time I've chased this topic in a video either. And I've recently spoken about map making and how throughout our lives, one way of thinking about part of what we're doing is we're making maps and comparing them to see where there's conflicts or where there's harmony in these maps we make. So I want to talk today a little bit about pathfinding in our human experience, in our deep interiority, in our life paths, in our relationships, in our thought and education too. And there's a super sense, which I spoke of in a previous video, without which our ordinary senses would be senseless, right? There's something that integrates all of our senses and makes of them meaningful and coherent, hopefully, experience and awareness. And what I want to talk about today is related to that supersense. And it's more than merely human orientations and imperatives. So we're all familiar with experiences of affinity, neutrality, and rejection or revulsion. Revulsion is a rather extreme word that reminds me a bit of disgust. But and notice how disgust is a fundamentally somatic sense, right? It's like in our gut. It's like the urge to throw up, to get rid of something. Oh no, we don't want this. I have to get rid of this. Revulsion. So we have these experiences of affinity and desire, attraction. Neutrality, right? We don't really care, we don't really notice it. And rejection or revulsion. And these are experiences of our interiority. Sometimes they're visceral, sometimes they're emotional, sometimes they're cognitive, right? We rationally decide, no, that's wrong, or no, that's bad. And of course, in reality, these distinctions are only modestly useful because underneath them, the intelligence of our body, and perhaps even our soul, is involved. It's just subtle enough that and we're so used to being who we are and how we are. It's subtle enough that unless our awareness is also relatively subtle, we won't notice the engagement of our soul. And we won't notice our supersenses because they're what we're looking with. It's like trying to notice your eye while you're seeing, in a way. Or becoming the flashlight in the dark room rather than using it to see objects and colors and forms and landscapes. But in the conversation last night, an old Greek word came up. And there's this idea that when we die, there's lots of different ideas, of course. But there's an idea that when we die, we undergo some transformations and we travel through some difficult terrain. And one of the stories is that we cross this river of forgetting, the river Lethe, the origin of the word lethal, which means to have our memory occluded, not necessarily obliterated, but hidden, so that we will continue this process of forgetting, most of us, though again it's kind of bipolar, there's both, in our human birth and our human life. But there's a Greek word that I'm very fond of. The word is anamnesis, and it's related to the word amnesia, which is not always actual forgetting. It's often used in senses that imply that there's a barrier, right? A barrier that keeps us from being able to access our memory. And strange things happen. Some people who have been in a coma awaken with mastery of languages they've never spoken before. There's all kinds of mysteries here that I think are important. I'm not the kind of person that pays too much attention to every possible anomaly and every conspiracy. Though it's weird that this word has become so common and popular in our time. And yet, at the same time, as something of a detective, I'm always on the lookout for little details that are like the keys that might unlock insight and understanding and awareness that's otherwise quite difficult to come by. Thus my attention to the tiny insect earlier. It's very uncommon for me to come across an insect I've never seen before, though I'm sure they're all around me. So I've been thinking, I think a lot about anamnesis, and I've spoken about it previously, but last night something particularly profound was going on in our conversation, in that we weren't simply discussing anamnesis, we were experiencing it in the context of discussing it. And so in a strange way, the ordinary polarity of language became reversed. And language became then the expression of something we were actually doing together. So we were pursuing anamnesis while our discussion oriented around it. And we made some progress, I think. And it was beautiful and really profound. And one of the things my friend said that was, I think, really important, she said, as we begin to talk about these things, I feel very timid. And also as if I'm trembling. And this was really deep, because the aspects of our interiority, what I sometimes call our original light, our soul, they're well aware that the human world is profoundly unfriendly to them and wants to compromise and capture and co-opt and evict and blame and torture and vilify them in all kinds of ways. And so I think it's natural that these feelings of timidity and of trembling accompany us when we travel into their proximity. And this is complicated because there are aspects of fear that emerge, unique forms of fear that emerge when we're in the presence of insight, or when our inner light begins to dawn in waking consciousness. And this is kind of mysterious. And may be related to not the fear of death so much as the fear of ego death, right? The death of the kind of mannequin self that we identify with while we're awake, less so when we're dreaming. But under some circumstances, in moments of deep communion, intimacy, attention, awareness, insight, wonder, creativity, joy, loss, terror, confusion too. In some of these moments, the fear inverts, and insight and anamnesis arise within us. And we begin to recognize, to see with the original light rather than the artificial light of representational thought and cognition, language and society. And some people chase this, or rather, when we have desire or neutrality or rejection, there's a kind of a pathfinding behavior going on. It's not necessarily that we're making a map, though we might be, and we also might be reenacting a map, but we're trying to actively find our way. And by our way, I mean a way true to our nature as human beings, as organisms, as spiritual beings, as individual creatures, as individual people, as quote-unquote separate people. But what I mean by that isn't separate, I just mean unique. Don't really mean separate. And while we're pathfinding, while we have desire or rejection, or we're triggered, or something's going on, part of what's happening is, and I say part because it can be overwhelmed by habit and noise, but part of what's happening is we're following a trail. With the deepest invisible blind aspect of ourself. The one who remembers having been many beings. The one who is still many beings. But the awareness of this has become occluded. And we could go deeper and say there are no beings. But this is not my goal here. So what I'm trying to get at here is that it's almost as if we're like someone tracking a strange animal. We're seeking anamnesis. And when we find the food we like, and we enjoy it, It's a little moment of anamnesis, of recognition, something fundamental. And particularly if we seek friendship or romantic love or intimacy, then again, it's anamnesis underneath all these desires and fears and concerns and collapsings of awareness and expansions of awareness. There's underneath that is the desire to recover our awareness and participation in the original family. In the world of original light. And so, within each of us, there's something a bit like a compass, or at least the needle of a compass. There's a directionality toward anamnesis. The sometimes gentle and sometimes severe retraction of all that occludes that blind, beautiful sense within us that knows its way back to origin, the same way a salmon finds its way from the ocean back to the stream it was born in, and even up the waterfalls. And all of life is like this direction, really, although it has both polarities, toward and away. And some of the away directions are, well, let's just call them very shiny. They look like they'll be bright and exciting. They look like something that could be desirable, but often this is due to the fact that they're mimicking some feature of anamnesis. As if the living human world has become expert at counterfeiting its appearances. And of course, when we follow these, we become more lost, more confused, and something in us begins to starve and hurt and hunger and thirst. For our participation and recognition of the nature of the great mystery of being. And again, it's ironic, we're formed of this mystery. But this is really the problem. It's all wrapped up in the forming thing, it's wrapped up in the form. And once it's wrapped up in the form, and we have actual senses and such, well, given the contexts that we exist in socially and ideologically and rationally and linguistically and pragmatically, the great forgetting continues throughout most of our lives. And it may be that some aspect of this is important, right? That this is part of what we come to human birth to learn about. That the unlosable essence, while it can never be lost, it can be hidden. And so we can lose contact with it. It's funny that the Greeks chose this word this way, because what they're saying, they didn't say remembering, they said something like unforgetting. And I think they were careful about this. But even if they weren't and it was a happy accident, it's a really happy accident. Because you can't remember what you are. You are. But you might be able to retract the occlusions that would otherwise render it inaccessible to awareness. I understood what my friend meant when she said she felt timid and was trembling. Because we'd gotten close to something very intimate that resists being handled, described, explained, named by the relatively sharp and artificial prostheses of linguistic consciousness. It hides in the daytime, sometimes emerging in dreams. But it hides because it knows the world in general, and for the most part, hunts it, wants the trophy. It's trying to kill it. And by the world, I don't mean the living natural world. That world is its own eyes and face and hands. No, it's the societal layer. It's the cultural layer. It's the commercial layer, the political layer, the religious layer, ironically, that are all hunting it, trying to convert it into something they can control or enslave or vilify or counterfeit. And so it is that for most of us throughout our lives, there's an aspect of our interiority that we protect very dearly. We don't bring it out for public discussion. And in fact, once we start making words, once I start making words, making face noises, I'm already fairly distracted. Because that process requires the conversion of faculties whose intelligences lie in silence. I wonder if just there you heard some wings in the recording, the fluttering of wings. If you did, it's good. Because that was a special moment. These faculties within us are vastly more powerful and more intelligent, more creative, more insightful, more wise than all that we exchange them for, mostly unknowingly in our lives. And this is the central message of most religion. Yeah. There's another way. that's true and good. And we come from it and we return to it in cycles over time, in lifetimes without number. And even the idea that we are separate beings, it's highly confused. There's a layer in which its truth is relatively obvious. The scope of that layer is profoundly narrow and can become more narrow as we depart, again, mostly unintentionally, from the palm of our origin, in which we might otherwise rest without concern. Or rather, without fear. And so I think that underneath all the pathfinding and map making and thinking and confusion we experience in life, there's an ache for anamnesis. And this is the lure that religions employ. And I don't wish to defame all religion. It's not my goal. And also it's important to understand that sometimes we might have to use a prosthesis for a while to become familiar with something so mysterious and invisible and unlike our imaginings that without it we'd have no inkling to trace out. And so in my own life, religious devotion has been profoundly useful, even though I no longer think of myself as belonging to some specific religion. You know, I have practices that are part of my pathfinding. But I don't take them as explicitly true. Right? Rather, they're a bit like children's stories or fables or myths. And it's not that, I mean, I'm not really here to talk about my particular path at the moment. But many of these stories and histories have been profoundly important to me and useful, even given their propensity to collapse into traps. And I can't tell if I've evaded the traps. It's not entirely clear to me. However, I'm not married to any of the specific narratives. Rather, it looks to me like all of the religions of the world, they're like petals on a single flower. And how could they be otherwise, really? They're different angles of perspective on this concern of anamnesis and of devotion to origin and communion. Anamnesis, unforgetting. And often we start out with a toy, and we play with a toy before we engage later in life with that which the toy represents. Whatever the truth of our origin and the nature of divinity may be like, or may be becoming, we always have within us that directionality, that felt sense of, this is like unforgetting. When I kiss her, I am unforgetting. When I care for the elderly person or the injured person or creature or place, I am unforgetting. Not because I'm thinking that, but because I'm feeling it. And so it occurred to me that the direction toward anamnesis is foundational to our pathfinding in life and thought and feeling and concern. In another part of the conversation, I was talking about how there's an aspect of me that's entirely blind to all my senses. It feels with a kind of living blindness, childlike, but unimaginably sensitive. And I remember, or rather I imagine, the first time my eyes saw sunlight or the moon, the first time I touched my mother from outside her body, the first time a girl kissed me in the erotic way. That first moment of our tongues touching, and how blind, how like an infant inside myself I was. And I trust this aspect. I trust my soul, adore my soul, precisely because it's not merely blind to all the distractions and noise of the human world, society and culture and so on. It's never fooled by them. This blindness I speak of is a form of seeing beyond all possible sensing. Extending from the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe, all at once, in every moment. And while it might appear delicate and fragile and unimaginable if we were to suddenly be capable of recognizing it, of seeing it in some way, its power supersedes all possible aggression or audacity. And this was another branch of our discussion last night, that there are forms of humility and altruism so beautiful that no power can stand against them. And part of the reason this is true is because communion has precedence to distinction. And this aspect of ourselves that sees and knows and feels in blindness, in vulnerability, without a voice to speak with, it's older than anything else. And all other things are really, in a sense, children of it, but also prostheses devised by shunting some of its light into a particular form and then conserving that form, propagating that form, popularizing that form, and so on. And so if it's, I don't think of it as in battle, but if we were to use this trope, it's in combat with something like its own skeletal remains. But it comes before them. And it is their origin. So when it meets them, they can't defeat it. And in fact, most often they'll simply recognize their own origin. Although this works out differently depending on how deep the situation is. In superficial layers, combat may well ensue. Because the skeletal remains wants to live and dominate and propagate pretty much at any cost, including the cost of its own destruction. And we can see this propensity in much of how the humans relate with each other and nature. Just then, as I was saying that, there was a car accident. I could hear it some ways away. If we think rationally, surely we will think something like, well, if someone threatens you with a weapon, you'd better overcome them. My father grew up in Brooklyn in the 50s, and he had to fight all the time. And he was kind of a small guy, and he was a pretty sensitive guy, but he became quite tough over time. And back then, the prevailing wisdom was, and still is, in the testosterone-fueled masculinization. Who knows? Maybe it's half estrogen-fueled. I'm not sure. But it's still a common idea today that if anyone disrespects you, you better step to them right now. Get the first punch in. First contender on the field has an advantage. So it really depends on how you look at it and why you're looking. But this is what most boys are, this is a common imprinting script that's used with males and sometimes with females. Perhaps a bit less often. And in the world of fighting, there's some wisdom there, but my father thought that I was too sensitive. And I think he was concerned, actually, that I was so feminine in my heart, so to speak. You know, again, this language is traditional from times in our culture that are different from this time now. But in their time, these ideas were widely held. And so I think, my father, I remember when my sister was studying ballet and I said, I want to do ballet too. My dad was like, nah, we're not having that. And I feel pretty sure that, he had some concern that I might be homosexual. And it's not clear whether, well, first of all, I think back then he was pretty homophobic. It's probably much less so now. I never really was either homosexual or homophobic. But he was concerned because he knew that, if it turned out that I was gay, I'd be facing 10 times the struggle I'd face as just a sensitive, I don't like the modern language tropes. A sensitive man who prefers women as romantic partners, or who only sees women as romantic partners. Except even that's not entirely true, because some of the deepest romances I've had, though they weren't sexual, were with my closest male friends. I've had a couple of really intense relationships that were actually like marriages. And when they, dissolved, and I had roles in that, it was very painful, at least as painful as the loss of a romantic relationship. So I think there's relational eros as well as romantic eros. And both are very powerful. But I brought this up because my father wanted me to fight. And I didn't get picked on very much, a little bit. But he wanted me to fight and I didn't want to fight. And what he didn't realize was that there are other options. In many situations where someone was intending to fight me, I just became very soft and vulnerable and asked them gentle questions and let them know that I'm not going to fight them. And there were other features of my way of being with other children and in the world that protected me from violence. Not entirely, but much more than my father ever imagined possible. I think he learned, the old adage, get the first punch in. Well, if that's your method, if that's the first move you generally have to make, then you won't discover the other possibilities of avoiding combat. My old Tai Chi teacher said, Casey Mao, may his soul be blessed. He said, you want to win a fight? First of all, don't fight. Secondly, get out of there. Fast. And thirdly, if you have to, and you have no other choice, if you're intelligent, softness can overcome hardness in the fight itself. Now, of course, this is a perspective from the wisdom tradition associated with Tai Chi. But one of the things he was really clearly saying was, don't stand there in the crisis and flow with the movement, because if you flow with the movement, you can't be hit. People can't land a forceful blow on you. But he was also fundamentally saying, get the fuck out of there. Like, before things collapse into crisis, get out, leave. You know? And there have been a number of situations in my life where I naturally got the hell out of there, much to the confusion of my pursuers. Of course, there are times when we may not be able to escape or settle things down. And then, of course, you know, my father's way has some bearing on the situation. You know, whenever I was in fights, this urge toward anamnesis became very present in my breast. And I felt a little scared of the person who's threatening me, but also just love. And how much I don't want to hurt them. Even if they're angry, or I'm angry, or they're confused, or we're both confused, or something going on, I don't want to hurt them. And sometimes when I had to fight, even though I'd not been injured, I'd be crying and crying and crying. And people would say, "What's wrong? What's wrong? Are you hurt?" And I'd say, "No. No, I didn't want to hurt them. I didn't want to hurt them." I had a lucky birth. As I've said before, I was born gentle. And I've lost a fight or two in my time as well. And I'm not exactly sure what it means to win a fight, but I know what the common meaning is, right? To prevail, to be the one less hurt, to be the last guy standing, this kind of thing. And I have some friends and family members that are very traditionally macho. And I have some part of that within me as well. But it's profoundly tempered by my gentleness. My impossible urge to do no harm. First, and to be of aid if at all possible. The magnetism of my anamnesis, my thirst for unforgetting, draws me profoundly towards altruism. And I'd like to undo the harms I've done through ignorance or fear, delusion, anger, confusion. But even these things that we don't want, they are gateways. They can be gateways to anamnesis. They can become. And it's the strange thing. It's really what use we make of our thought and experience that determines the result. It's not necessarily the flavor of thought and experience. It's how we use it. Literally, what we make of it in thought and feeling, awareness and relation. My old teacher, John Tarrant Roshi, he's skillful at helping people to see that if we want to grow and unforget struggle and strife and illness and poverty and loss and pain and suffering, confusion, anger, and fear, can be extremely valuable. And it's easy to even pragmatically see why this is so. In a life of comfort, in a life of safety, inside the box, protected from everything, just about, except time and isolation, loneliness. In comfort, why shall we strive? I've often heard some of my Blackfoot friends talk about how the sun sends us challenges, because without these challenges we would not develop. And this doesn't mean, when I say these kinds of things, that I don't deeply feel with and for myself and others when we're frightened or suffering or alone or injured or sick or dying. Of course I feel with them. Certainly don't sit back thinking something like, these are the challenges that are drawing you into transformation, perhaps awakening. Maybe in the back of my mind I have some idea like this, and I might, if it seems appropriate, I might mention it. But no, I feel deep compassion for myself and others who are suffering. And I don't just think, these are the good challenges. But I'm also aware, at the same time, that in my own life and in the lives of others that I love, it's the challenges, when we're in jeopardy. It's harder to be lazy, right? Not impossible, but it's harder to be lazy. And we're much more likely to find within us the traces of our original light, our souls, and draw them into embodiment in our actions and relationships and learning. The blind one who sees what the sighted cannot see. The one who is so humble and altruistic that the warrior's arm loses its strength when facing him or her or them. Yeah. There's something profound and beautiful here. And I trust it. When I trust it. I don't trust it abstractly, I don't trust it as an idea. I trust it when I've become it. And I'm sensing it. And I'm sensing as my heart, as my soul. And in reflecting on these things, we nourish them. If our reflections are oriented in such a way that we're not all up in our heads about it, but rather we're in a context that protects and nurtures and recognizes the sensitivities and vulnerabilities of our secret interiority, the invisibles, and thus creates a context where it's safe for them to emerge into awareness and become embodied and participated. And in our common lives, such things seem rare, though each person's life is unique, and in some people's lives, perhaps it is common. And it's even possible to find a way, or to make a way, that we can embody our interiority safely, creatively, beautifully, harmoniously. And even though the world can be understood as its enemy, that's not the only thing going on. Because everything, every being, every place, every moment, every context traces its emergence back to origins. And those origins are in communion. Those origins are in unity. So if we're inspired and a little bit courageous, we can form these contexts together. And retract the veils. And bathe in the light, that reassuring, beautiful, transcendental light of anamnesis. Together. With and for each other and all beings. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon.